Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Bipolar, Not So Much, Understanding Your Mood Swings and Depression, by Chris Aiken, M.D., and James Phelps, M.D., narrated by Charles Constant. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type Bipolar Not So Much into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code STRESS, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All figures, tables, appendices, mood spectrum, PHQ, and the Aiken mixity scale referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Introduction. I would take physical pain over this any day. It's a bleak wish, but it's one we often hear from people with depression. Depression confuses the mind, strips away hope, and causes people to blame themselves for an illness they never asked for. I must be doing something wrong because medications never work for me, said a man who had tried 9 antidepressants. Depression is making me depressed, said another who had suffered for 20 years before receiving the correct diagnosis. If you've been in that place and found that antidepressants didn't live up to their name, then this book may be for you. We begin by bringing clarity to the diagnosis of depression. It turns out there are many types, and tests are available that can identify them just as accurately as a laboratory workup does for medical illness. Then we walk you through the treatments that can work when antidepressants haven't. Last, we talk about the most important things you and your family can do to further your recovery. This book comes on a wave of increasing understanding of mood disorders and their treatment. Depression turns out to be caused by a very large number of genes that interact with environmental stress. These stressors lead to molecular changes inside the brain that are part of a normal process, called neuroplasticity, that gets carried too far in depression. The brain regions associated with depressions have been so well identified that some research groups are now treating the illness with tiny amounts of electric current delivered precisely into the affected areas, a technique borrowed from the treatment of Parkinson's disease. Meanwhile, through a literal act of Congress, pharmaceutical companies are now required to release all of their studies, including those that didn't turn out as planned. The full set of data has shown that antidepressants are often ineffective. Only about 30% of those who take an antidepressant reach full recovery. The rest respond partially or not at all. A few people get worse on them, and we now have clues to help identify them before they are given an antidepressant. Unfortunately, the whole concept of depression is being re-examined and recognized to form a spectrum of problems from plain depression on one end to full bipolar disorder on the other. In between are huge numbers of people who don't have bipolar disorder but don't have plain depression either. They're in the middle of the mood spectrum. This idea of a mood or bipolar spectrum used to be hotly debated, but most mood experts now acknowledge that there is no place to put a dividing line between plain depression and bipolar disorder. This change has given researchers the green light to seek more refined treatments, and we're beginning to see the fruits of their labors. The only good thing about depression is that it can go away completely. If you haven't reached full recovery, it's a good idea to look again at your diagnosis. Or if you're considering treatment for the first time, you'll also want to begin with a detailed look at all the diagnostic possibilities for someone who is depressed. We'll start there. Part 1. What type of depression do you have? 1. Understanding the mood spectrum. Key point. There's a spectrum of mood problems from depression to bipolar. Depressions that fall in the middle of that spectrum don't fit neatly into diagnostic categories. An accurate diagnosis can help you find the right treatment. There are over 30 antidepressants in the United States, but there's a type of depression that won't respond to any of them. In fact, antidepressants can even make it worse. 1 out of every 3 people who seek help for depression have it. But it's so hard to recognize that it takes, on average, 10 years to accurately diagnose. The depression we're thinking of is not bipolar disorder. It's not plain depression either, but it falls somewhere in between these two extremes. It feels like depression, but with an extra edge that's hard to describe. Restless, agitated, anxious energy, mood swings. These are a few of the words our patients have used for it. You could call it bipolar, and some people do. But we think that word describes it not so much. At least, not in the sense that most people mean when they say bipolar. In everyday use, bipolar means bipolar I disorder, where moods cycle between depressive lows and ecstatic but destructive highs. Bipolar means two poles, which are the manic and depressive sides that it swings between. Plain depression is called unipolar depression, as it only has one pole and no trace of mania. There's not a good word for the type of depression we have in mind, but we think you'll find it easier to understand if we let go of diagnostic labels for a moment and look at depression from a different angle. It's called the mood spectrum. The mood spectrum. In the mood spectrum view, there are many variations of depression, not just unipolar and bipolar. They form a continuous spectrum with shades of gray rather than black lines between them. At the extreme ends of the spectrum are pure unipolar depression and classic bipolar disorder with full mania, called bipolar I. Between these extremes are depressions with milder bipolar features. Though the bipolar features may be mild, the depressions in this gray zone can be severe. The mood spectrum is not a new idea. It was first presented by Emil Kraepelin, a German physician who discovered bipolar disorders in the early 1900s. In those days, bipolar was called manic depression, and that term applied to both ends of the spectrum. The idea of separating those poles into unipolar and bipolar categories first came about in the 1960s, and this separation became official when the third edition of the Diagnostic Rule Book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM for short, became widely adopted in 1980. There was a good reason behind this separation, as there are significant differences in the genetics, life history, and treatment of the disorders on the extreme ends of the spectrum, unipolar depression and bipolar I. Lost in the translation was the large number of people who fell in the middle of the spectrum. There were more treatments for the depressive side, so most patients in the gray area were shunted into the unipolar depressed category. It took years for psychiatrists to figure out that antidepressants weren't working for the majority of those folks. By the 1990s, Dr. Kraepelin's books were out of print in English, and we had to relearn what the field had forgotten. A host of researchers have spent the last 2 decades advancing our understanding of depression, and ironically this has brought them back to Kraepelin's original insight, that depression and mania exist on a spectrum. In this view, the diagnostic question is where are they on the spectrum, rather than do they have bipolar disorder. You can hardly imagine how radical it was just 10 years ago to talk like that. It went straight against the DSM rulebook. Since then, the idea of a mood spectrum has steadily gained acceptance, and the new DSM, called DSM-5, now recognizes several disorders within the spectrum: bipolar II disorder, cyclothymic disorder, depression with short-duration hypomanias, depression with mixed features. Those categories will help a lot of people find their way to the right treatment, but we still think that they are better understood through a spectrum lens rather than the corner that categories can back us into. The diagnostic question in the DSM-5 remains a black and white one. Does she have bipolar disorder or not? Still, many leaders in the field are steering this question toward a spectrum view. Here are just a few examples. In 2004, the Harvard Associated Mood Clinic started asking, "How bipolar is she?" and devised a rating scale to answer this question that we'll present in Chapter 5. At the National Institute of Mental Health, the group studying complex mood disorders is now called the Bipolar Spectrum Disorders Section. The chief of that section, Dr. Ellen Liebenluft, has said that the cutoffs between bipolar and unipolar mood disorders are inevitably arbitrary because they are imposed on fully continuous, smooth distributions of mood problems. Even the chairman of the DSM, Dr. David Kupfer, has declared in a separate article that mood disorders are better thought of as an affective disorders continuum, a spectrum. To be fair, there are good reasons why the DSM takes a categorical rather than a spectrum approach, but those reasons probably don't apply to our listeners. The DSM is not just used by psychiatrists and therapists who see the continuum of mood disorders every day. It is also used by insurers, researchers, and lawyers, who all need diagnoses with clear cutoffs. It is always difficult to get insurers to cover mental health, and fuzzy spectrum concepts would not make that any easier. Researchers need clear definitions for specific groups of patients, even if they are only a part of a continuum. And the legal system is not set up to handle shades of gray. So, for the most part, The DSM-5 hung on to a system of cutoffs for mood disorders, despite many of the mood community members recognizing that a spectrum model is closer to reality. Calling it what it is: stigma. In writing this book, we struggled over what to call the depressions in the middle of the mood spectrum. There's a lot of stigma attached to the word bipolar. It sounds too close to bipolar 1, which conjures up images of mania and the destructive behaviors it brings, like spending into bankruptcy or having 3 affairs in a week. Many of our patients on the spectrum have a relative with bipolar 1, and they're quick to point out, "There's no way I could have bipolar. I'm nothing like my Uncle Dennis." On the other hand, we didn't want to add to the stigma by ignoring the bipolar word. So we settled on the term depression with bipolarity, or bipolarity for short. Remember, it's not the same as bipolar disorder, or at least not so much. Whatever the word is, we have reason to hope that the stigma around it may start to change. The word depression once carried as much stigma as bipolar does today. That was before the 1960s, when the first medications for depression came out. Effective treatment brought greater awareness, and many brave people came forward, excited yet scared to speak up about the remarkable recoveries they experienced with antidepressants. This is starting to happen for bipolar. Perhaps you may play a role in reducing that stigma yet further. There was a long wait between the first effective medicine for bipolar depression, lithium in 1949, and the second, lamotrigine or Lamictal, in 2004. Since then, around a dozen more have appeared, and as we write this book, the first television ads for bipolar depression have aired, promoting another new option. Prominent people are speaking up about their experience with bipolar, from Congress, Patrick Kennedy, Jesse Jackson Jr., to Hollywood, Ben Stiller, Catherine Zeta-Jones, to the world of professional sports, Darryl Strawberry, Keith O'Neill. Before we get carried away on the bipolar bandwagon, let's slow down for a word of caution. Most medications for bipolar disorder carry greater medical risks than antidepressants. One shouldn't conclude that they have bipolarity solely because antidepressants didn't work. Bipolarity is not the only reason people don't respond to antidepressants, it's just the most common. We hope this book will help you figure out where you are on the mood spectrum, unipolar, bipolar, or somewhere in between. We'll walk you through the symptoms, give you some diagnostic tests, and offer tips to help you share what you learn with your doctor. Whatever word you end up with in your diagnosis, keep an open mind about it. Even the best physicians and medical tests can be wrong, and the spectrum view of mood is not without flaws. With those disclaimers in mind, let's turn now to the 4 key mood episodes that make up the spectrum: depression, hypomania, mania, and mixed states. 2. The downside: depression. Key point: depression is a low-energy state that drains motivation and slows down the mind and body. The next few chapters describe the major moods in the spectrum: depression, hypomania, mania, and mixed states. We'll start with depression, as nearly everyone on the mood spectrum has experienced that one. It's also the longest of the major moods. Depressions tend to linger for months or years, while hypomanic episodes tend to last a few days. Depression is not a moral weakness. Like many health problems, it is strongly influenced by genes that people don't choose and stresses they have little control over. Unlike other health problems, depression tries to convince people that it's their own fault. The more they get convinced of that, the more depressed they become. It's a terrible loop, but that loop is not the person's fault either. A shift in brain chemistry makes such thoughts more likely. True, some choices can make it worse: poor diet, lack of exercise, irregular sleep, impulsive risk-taking, and so forth. But even these choices are strongly affected by mood. Diet and exercise are hard enough to stick with when your mood is fine, and depression doesn't make this any easier. What's the point? Nobody cares. I don't really care. It won't get any better anyway. Depressions tend to be more frequent for people with bipolarity, such as several times a year. This kind of depression can grow like a weed and even take over the whole garden. This weed feeds on vicious cycles, such as the one we just described, where depression creates self-blame, which creates more depression. If that analogy rings true, take hope. These weeds can also shrink back, and we'll give you tools to fight them in the second half of this book. But first, you'll need to recognize what depression is and what it isn't. We don't want to trample over any flowers while we're cutting back the weeds. Depression is not the same as sadness. Severe depression can actually numb emotions to the point that people are unable to cry. When that happens, the appearance of tears may be a sign of recovery. Mistaking sadness for depression runs the risk of pathologizing normal emotions. If you've ever heard someone ask, "Did you take your medicine today?" when you show genuine emotion, then you know what we mean by pathologizing. Rather than sadness, we recommend looking at energy and motivation to figure out whether you're in a depressed state. Depression tends to slow things down. Thoughts are sluggish and energy is low. The body is impacted as much as the mind, and muscles can feel weak, heavy, and slow to move. Even the brain's sense of time grinds down, so that minutes feel like hours and hours like days. Let's look at a few other depressive symptoms in more detail. Self-blame and guilt. One aspect of depression that makes it so dangerous is self-blame, sometimes called recrimination or reproach. Weird, isn't it? What possible value could this kind of thinking have? Perhaps a small dose could help people stay humble, but a big dose can pull people into a downward spiral of depression. Severe depression can pull self-confidence down to a delusionally low level. For example, a man might think that he somehow caused a bad car accident, even though he was miles away and completely uninvolved. When it is extreme like that, it's easy for others to see the delusion. But when just a bit less extreme, poof, the idea that self-blame could be somewhat delusional is completely lost. People think terrible thoughts about themselves, and it somehow seems normal, not even close to a delusion. For example, one of our patients was standing in her kitchen and heard her mind come up with the thought, "Everyone else can empty their dishwasher but me. I can't even get that done." This doesn't sound like a delusion, does it? Yet think about it. First of all, plenty of other people are slow to get their clean dishes out of the dishwasher. More importantly, this woman has emptied her dishwasher hundreds of times, but her mind is not giving her any credit for that. If your bank statement was this inaccurate, you wouldn't think, "Oh, someone made an error." You'd think, "This is utter fraud." Our patient was amazed to realize, as her depression improved, how extreme her self-blame had been. At the time, it seemed completely appropriate. In our psych lingo, this is called mood-congruent cognition. In plain English, thoughts that match your mood. The problem is that depressed thoughts don't come with a label on them saying, "made in depression." They just come along, one after another, and seem so right. Then people try to think their way out of their depression. "I shouldn't be like this. I'm bringing everyone down. I have to get out of this." But they don't realize they're trying to solve the problem with the same tool that caused it, their mind. It's as though they're in a deep hole and the only tool they have to get out is a shovel, so they just keep digging themselves in deeper. Several forms of psychotherapy teach people new tools to get out of depression. They learn to recognize depressive thoughts for what they are, thoughts, not the truth, and to find more meaningful ways of living in the face of them. The right medication can also shift mood enough to bring those thoughts within reach of these therapies, or sometimes just stop them entirely. Bottom line, depression can make minds lose track of truth. One of our patients calls them depression lies. These lies can reach delusional levels. Motivation and pleasure. When the brain is working well, it constantly passes information between the thinking center, called the frontal lobes, and the emotional center, called the limbic system. This allows people to move easily throughout the day, staying on task, making good decisions, and keeping up with their priorities. They may even feel like their own willpower is responsible for the success, and take for granted the fact that this quiet engine in their brain is really running the show. During depression, that engine shuts down. Everyday tasks become overwhelming, and simple decisions are paralyzing. This is a big problem for someone trying to go to work, finish school, or run a household. The good news here is that effective treatment can do more than improve mood. It can help you function better, so life can get underway again. Appetite and weight. Depression can make appetite go up or down. People can gain or lose weight during depression, and sometimes depression can slow metabolism to the point that it's hard to lose weight even when dieting. Appetite is one of the few symptoms that can tell a little about where you are on the spectrum. There is a form of depression, called atypical depression, that involves dramatic increases in appetite and sleep. Atypical depression is slightly more common on the bipolar side of the spectrum, but only slightly and not enough to make the diagnosis. Sleep. Depression can change sleep in both directions, from too much to too little. It also alters sleep quality, so even those who oversleep during depression are unlikely to feel refreshed when they wake up. How are bipolar and unipolar depression different? After all the fuss we've made about distinguishing bipolar and unipolar depression, it may come as a surprise that the DSM defines both of these depressions the same way. We agree with the DSM here. Depression looks pretty much the same whether it comes from the unipolar or the bipolar side. This is partly why diagnosis is so difficult. There are a few hints that a depression may be a bipolar type, though none of these are definitive. Bipolar depression tends to be shorter, lasting 1 to 4 months, and come on quickly, over a few days. Unipolar depressions last longer, 3 to 6 months, and start gradually. Bipolar depressions are likely to recur more frequently, in other words 2 to 4 times a year, though that can happen in unipolar as well. A more reliable way to tell them apart is to look at when the depression first appeared. Bipolar depressions tend to start early, between ages 15 to 20. Unipolar depressions first appear around age 30 to 40. If someone has their first depression after age 35, it's very unlikely to be a bipolar type. We'll look at more telltale signs of bipolarity in Chapter 5. For now, let's move on to that elusive state of mind that officially separates bipolar from unipolar disorder: hypomania. Sizing it up. A self-test for depression. The Patient Health Questionnaire 9, PHQ-9, as shown in the bonus material, is one of the most widely used tests to screen for depression. You can also use it to track your progress while starting new treatments. Scoring. Add all the numbers in items 1 to 9 to arrive at your final score, from 0 to 27. The final item does not impact your score. It's there to remind us that it's normal to have symptoms of depression now and then, and it's unlikely to be a disorder unless it's making life difficult. The cutoffs in Table 2.1 allow you to compare your score to the general population. These are based on averages, so it's not set in stone that your depression is mild just because you scored a 7. 3. The upside, from hypomania to mania, and everything in between. Key point. Mania and hypomania take many forms, but at their core they are both states of high energy. The difference between them is one of degree. In mania, there is a significant loss of self-control, while in hypomania, people can still put the brakes on. I was silly and giddy 1 minute, bursting with rage the next, running around excitedly in the afternoon but impossible to rouse out of bed in the morning. Go-Go Lintz, New York Magazine. Mania and hypomania are often called the upside of mood, but that doesn't mean they feel good. I felt infinitely worse during mania than when in the midst of my worst depressions, wrote Kay Redfield Jameson, a psychologist who has spoken up about her own experience with bipolar disorder. Mania turns the volume up on whatever is going on inside you, and it's not always good stuff. Anxiety can turn into uninterruptible worry and dread. Irritability can turn dangerous. There are moments where pleasure is heightened as well, but those are rare and more likely to lead to addiction than contentment. Most commonly, it's energy that goes up. Hypomania means a little manic. Sometimes it's so little that it almost looks normal. A little more talkative, a little more active, a little more confident. Wait, this is starting to sound like just about anyone on their best day. That's true. Every symptom of hypomania also happens to normal folks. There's a spectrum from normal to hypomanic to fully manic. The lines between them are not always clear, but we'll try to show you some guide points in this chapter. Hypomania is the least understood and the hardest to recognize of the moods. There are at least 3 big reasons for that. Hypomania is misunderstood as a happy euphoric state. Hypomania is rare and brief compared with depression. Self-awareness goes down during hypomania, so it's often quickly forgotten. In contrast, self-awareness goes up in depression, and painfully so. There are many faces to hypomania, and it's a state of rapid flux. Depression tends to sit still. Its message is, don't take risks, don't bother changing anything. There's no point anyway. In contrast, hypomania is always on the go. We're going to slow it down for the rest of this chapter so you can see what's going on one symptom at a time. Hypomania, frame by frame. Everyone's experience with hypomania is a little different, as its many symptoms can mix in various ways. The DSM-5 counts 9 symptoms of hypomania, and we've added a few more here. They can happen at the same time or scattered around, flickering on and off like Christmas lights. Sometimes one symptom flares up by itself, like the racing thoughts that our patients struggle to shut off, especially at night. The core feature of hypomania is increased energy. Nearly everyone will experience that in a true hypomanic state, so let's start there. Increased energy and activity. Energy is key to understanding both depression and hypomania. In depression, energy is low, and in hypomania, it's high. Elevated energy may not stand out in the daytime. People just get things done. Students make up for depressed times when they missed class. Workers finish projects. Homemakers organize. None of this may look unusual. But at night, when most people are winding down, this high energy becomes a bit more noticeable. One of the most common symptoms in hypomania is cleaning the house all night. People go from room to room, decorating and rearranging, often working on several areas at the same time and finishing none. In recent years, we're seeing this evening activity shift to the digital realm, as all-night social media marathons have become a common sign of hypomania. Sometimes the excess energy is visible even in the doctor's office. Patients practically vibrate with energy, fidgeting, bouncing their knees up and down, as though they're ready to leap up and head out the door at any moment. Bottom line, if you're wondering whether a certain phase is hypomanic, look for the energy. It will almost always be increased. This doesn't necessarily mean you're bouncing off the walls, just more energized than your usual state. Intense emotions. Emotions tend to be more extreme in hypomania. When they rise high, it's called euphoria. A euphoric mood is a state of exalted joy, where troubles wash away and pleasure intensifies. For some, it is a state of almost spiritual transcendence. Euphoria is a classic symptom of hypomania, but it's also a rare one. You'll see that paradox a lot in this chapter. Many of the hallmark signs of hypomania are also the least common. More often, emotions intensify in hypomania by swinging rapidly from one extreme to another, which is called lability. Laughter turns to tears, and friendly cheer switches quickly into hateful scorn. There are a lot of dark emotions that go along with hypomania. Surprisingly, anxiety is more common in hypomania than in depression. In another surprise, researchers once asked people with mania and hypomania what they were suffering from. The most common answer: depression. Those patients weren't wrong. They were just answering in terms of emotions rather than energy. Feelings run deep in relationships during hypomania. You may fall in love too easily or feel an intense connection with people you just met. It can take years to figure out that these relationships were not quite as fantastic as they first seemed. Everyone is fantastic in their own way, of course, but no one is quite as fantastic as a new acquaintance who came into your life during a hypomania. Irritability. Irritability is one of the easiest symptoms of hypomania to recognize, especially for family members. However, it's also common in many other psychiatric disorders, so it's not the most useful in making a diagnosis. Yet another reason why hypomania goes undetected. The telltale sign of irritability is that you react with great anger over minor matters. However, those matters don't seem minor at the time. For example, Jeremiah knows he's in trouble when he starts getting angry in the checkout line in the grocery store. The clerk is unbelievably slow, and his conversations with the shoppers are so bothersome. Can anyone be that dumb to think such trivia is worth putting into words? Where did they find this clown? But Jeremiah learned the hard way that this experience in the checkout line is a warning. His last girlfriend left him after he came home from the grocery store in such a rage that he threw a can of beans across the room. She'd seen this kind of thing before, and that one was the last straw. It's very hard to recognize your own irritability during hypomania, in part because of the way hypomania affects the mind. self-awareness falls, so it's hard to see your own role in the problem.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?